Forget the scraps. Watch how the whole farm works together.
Somewhere back in these hills, there's a photograph you've probably seen a version of. A sagging barn, a corn crib off to one side, and 8 or 10 hens scratching around the yard like they own the place. And nearly everybody who looks at a picture like that thinks the same thing. Those chickens lived on scraps. They didn't. Now, I'm not romanticizing anybody. Those birds weren't better fed than yours. A lot were fed worse, and it showed in the egg basket come February. But that family wasn't throwing table leavings out the back door and calling it a feeding program. They were running a system. Messy, seasonal, imperfect, but a system. Corn had a job, milk had a job, bugs had a job, greens had a job, and not one of them was ever expected to do every job at once. That right there is the whole difference, and it's the part the internet has gotten exactly backwards. Go looking for old-time chicken feeding today and you'll trip over the same promise 100 times. Feed this one thing and never buy chicken feed again. It's always one ingredient, and it's always sold as the secret the old-timers knew. Trouble is, the old-timers didn't believe it either. In 1927, the Department of Agriculture put out a bulletin called Feeding Chickens. Not a blog post, a government bulletin, sold for a nickel, written for exactly the kind of farm we're talking about. And right in its own summary, it says that in feeding all classes of poultry, a proper balance of the various nutrients is necessary, especially proteins, carbohydrates, minerals, and vitamins.
That's the clue. The old advice was already about balance, not shortcuts.
That again. Nearly 100 years ago, before most farms had ever seen a bag of complete layer feed, the advice was already balance. Not a magic ingredient. Balance. So here are 15 things farm families around here could genuinely put in front of a flock when the feed store wasn't an option, not a list. What each one actually did, what it couldn't do, and which season it showed up in. And I'll tell you now, one of the most important things those old farmers gave their chickens wasn't food at all. Not a grain, not a green, not a protein. And it's the thing I see backyard folks get flat wrong more than anything else. I'll get to it before we're done. First, why any of this worked. Before poultry got specialized, a flock of hens wasn't a poultry operation. It was one moving part in a diversified farm. West Virginia shows how recently that changed. State records from January of 1938 counted about 4 million chickens on West Virginia farms and made no mention of broiler chickens at all. 2 years later, 4 million broilers were produced. And beginning around 1950, poultry there shifted from farm flocks to specialized broiler production under contract to a meat processor. So the old way isn't ancient history. It's your grandmother's lifetime. On a farm like that, the chickens weren't fed from a bag. They were plugged into the farm's waste stream. Cornfield to chicken, garden surplus to chicken, milk house to chicken, bug to chicken. But here's the sentence I want you.
Keep this distinction close. Thrift only works when you know the limits.
You carrying through this whole video. Available is not the same as complete. Free, handy, and eagerly eaten does not make something feed. The first 3 are the energy end of the barnyard. Number 1 is cracked corn. I suspect you saw that coming, so let me flip it on you right away. Corn earned its place honestly. It grew here, it's stored well in a crib, it cracked easy by hand, and it's dense in calories. Going into a cold snap, corn was a sensible thing to put in front of a flock. But Mississippi State Extension puts the modern reality plainly. Corn is an excellent ingredient for poultry diets, but it should not be fed as the only feed for hens. Corn is fuel. Corn is not a ration. A hen filling up on corn has met her calorie needs and shorted her protein, her calcium, and a good share of her vitamins. In summer, laying hard, that's the worst time to do it. Number 2 is wheat, oats.
Corn is useful. The mistake is asking one grain to carry the flock.
And barley. And here's where you meet the actual old farm mindset. There's a USDA notice from 1930 saying that for all-purpose feeding, a pound of cracked wheat or a pound of cracked barley was equal in feeding value to a pound of corn. They printed it because drought had wrecked the corn crop and farmers needed to know they could swap. That tells you how these people thought. They weren't asking which grain is the miracle grain. They were asking which grain do I already have. But swapping grains doesn't change the category. Oats aren't secretly protein. Barley isn't secretly minerals. You've traded one energy source for another, and the hole in the ration is right where you left it. Number 3 is bran, middlings.
Now follow the leftovers from the mill, not the leftovers from dinner.
And mill leavings, and almost nobody thinks of this one. Carry grain to a mill, and you didn't just come home with meal. You came home with what the mill couldn't sell to a bakery. Bran, middlings, coarse siftings. That's not garbage. Wheat middlings are still a legitimate energy ingredient in poultry diets, and the University of Georgia makes what I think is the most underrated point in livestock keeping. We're surrounded by nutrients that go unused for human food, and by raising chickens, we take ingredients humans won't eat and turn them into eggs and meat. Old farmers weren't just feeding crops, they were feeding the byproducts of processing crops, a circular farm economy 80 years before anybody named it. One caution, though. Mill leavings go moldy faster than whole grain. Now step outside, because the farmyard itself was part of the feed bin. Number 4 is pasture, clover, and seed heads. And I need to correct a myth that costs people money every year. Chickens are not little cows. They're omnivores, not...
Here's where a green field can fool a chicken keeper.
Ruminants, and they can't break down cellulose the way a cow does. Sarah's own poultry work says it plainly. Birds can't digest the cellulose in most plants very efficiently, and while a greens-only diet won't sustain life, greens do make a real difference in health. Here's the number that ought to end the argument. Research summarized by the National Center for Appropriate Technology found a chicken gains between 129 and 246 calories per pound of forage eaten. Yellow dent corn supplies around 1,632 calories per pound. One study found broilers on pasture got only about 3% of their energy needs from forage. So grass is not a feed bill solution. But don't hear me wrong. The value of a chicken pasture isn't the grass you can see. It's everything seeding and crawling underneath it. Working estimates put pastured poultry at 5 to 20% of their diet from pasture, with savings biggest in late spring and early fall, which is exactly when the bugs are thickest. Which brings us to number 5, and this is the part of free-ranging that actually pays.
Pasture pays best when it comes alive, not when it just looks green.
Beetles, grubs, worms, crickets, and grasshoppers. You've seen it. Turn a shovel of ground and the hens are on it before you straighten your back. Lift an old board and it's a stampede. By weight, insects and other invertebrates provide roughly 4 times more usable protein and energy for poultry than a bag of feed does. And there's something better hiding in that. The amino acid most likely to run short in a chicken is methionine, and grains are poor in it. The best natural sources of methionine are animal proteins, which means insects and fish, not grass. When hens run short of methionine, one of the first things you see is feather pecking. So bugs aren't a treat. Bugs are the protein patch on a grain diet. But be honest about the limit. A bug is a protein opportunity, not a protein guarantee, and there are no grasshoppers in February. Now the garden. Because on these farms, the garden fed 2 species. Number 6 is ugly vegetables and garden culls, the zucchini that got away from you, the cracked tomato.
Now we move from what the hens hunt to what the garden rejects.
The melon that split on the vine after a rain. There's real precedent here. When the USDA studied surplus potatoes for livestock in 1948, they estimated 10 to 20% of the national crop each year was unsuitable for human food, and part of it went to livestock on the farm where it grew. Culls have always been a real category, and feeding them is honest thrift. But be clear about what you're handing the bird. An Oregon State poultry specialist put it bluntly. If it's a high-fiber leafy green vegetable, it sounds good, but it's mostly water, sugar, and fiber. Cutting food waste is a fine goal. Don't confuse it with replacing feed. Number 7 is where the garden gets serious. Kale, cabbage, clover, and alfalfa. This wasn't casual.
Waste is one thing. Growing a missing nutrient on purpose is another.
On real poultry farms, greens were a crop. Kale was grown specifically to be harvested as chicken food, and one variety, thousand-headed kale, shows up again and again in old accounts because it grew tall and hardy and could be cut leaf by leaf all season. Bigger farms planted acres. Alfalfa and clover meal were considered essential, and here's the interesting part. They were valued for something farmers couldn't even name yet. Before the middle of the 20th century, forages were the only reliable source of certain nutrients, vitamin chief among them, and a deficiency caused devastating disease. They didn't know what was in the kale. They knew what happened to birds that didn't get it. That flips the modern question. We ask how much protein is in this. Old ration thinking asked a better one. What is the grain missing? Number 8 is sprouted oats. And I have to be careful here, because this one has turned into mythology. The practice is real and beautifully done.
That question matters more than any feed trend. What is actually missing?
Documented. A 1930 poultry management textbook lays out a whole oat sprouter system, soaking grain and moving it through trays to germinate. Farms genuinely did this, but understand why. They were not multiplying nutrition. They were manufacturing green feed in the dead of winter, when the pasture was brown and the kale was under snow. And the science isn't on the side of the miracle claims. When a USTA Agricultural Research Service scientist tested sprouted barley, the best yield she got was about a 327% increase in weight, roughly half what sprouting systems advertise. Correct for water and look at actual dry matter, and she measured about a 21% loss in energy. A fifth of the energy in that grain burned up in the sprouting itself. That work was in dairy cattle, but the physics doesn't care what's eating it. Sprouting doesn't create nutrients. It rearranges them and adds a great deal of water. So sprout oats if you want a green tray in January and happier birds. That's a good reason. Just don't tell yourself you turn cheap grain into protein. Number 9 is pumpkins and winter squash. And this is a storage story more than a nutrition story. Come September, the garden hands you more squash than a family can eat.
A useful winter practice doesn't need a miracle story to be valuable.
And it keeps in a cellar for months. When the pile started going soft, the hens got it. But I have to take a swing at the biggest claim attached to this one. You'll hear everywhere that pumpkin seeds are a natural dewormer. The honest answer is that the evidence is thin and mixed. A peer-reviewed trial in native chickens, published in 2019, compared ground pumpkin seed against mebendazole. Pumpkin seed came out moderately effective against 2 worm genera and only marginally active against a third. The conventional dewormer cleaned them out. That's not nothing. It's also not a deworming program. If you've got a worm problem, you need a diagnosis and a real treatment, not a jack-o'-lantern. The pumpkin wasn't medicine. It was stored sunshine that didn't need a feed sack. Number 10 is turnips.
And this is where thrift has to give way to proper treatment.
Rutabagas and root crops. And this one carries a lesson that has nothing to do with nutrition. Old poultry keepers fed rootstocks through the winter, mangels and carrots especially, alongside hardy greens. And the reason given in the old accounts is worth hearing. Yes, it gave a nutritional boost, but it also helped reduce excessive pecking in the flock during winter by keeping the hens occupied. They were managing behavior. A bored, confined flock in February will start in on each other, and a turnip on the coop floor buys you an afternoon of peace. Old farmers didn't always use a thing because it was the best feed. They used it because it was there in February, and because it kept the birds busy. Availability had value. So did occupation. Number 11 is windfall apples and orchard fruit. Bruised apples, pears that dropped early, berries gone soft. Even the USTA took this seriously, publishing research in 1923 on dried apple pomace, the press cake left from cider making, as a stock food. But rank it honestly. Fruit is sugar and water. Chickens love it, and a chicken loving something tells you nothing about whether it belongs in the ration. That's the most common mistake in backyard feeding. Mistaking enthusiasm for nutrition. That brings us to the kitchen, and a title like this one always gets dragged toward kitchen scraps. The kitchen was never the feed mill. Number 12 is table scraps and cooked vegetables. The bucket by the door. Leftover cornbread, potato peelings, the last of the beans. Historic poultry keeping absolutely included.
The kitchen can help the flock, but it should never run the ration.
Small farm flocks scavenged most of their diet from pastures, barnyards, orchards, and fields, with occasional supplementation from scratch grains and table and garden scraps. Note the word occasional. Oregon State gives you the modern rule. Feed only as much scratch as birds can clean up in about 20 minutes, roughly 10 to 15% of daily intake, and apply that same rule to table scraps and greens. As their specialist says, the biggest mistake is too much supplement. 2 hard rules: nothing moldy, ever, and rake out wet scraps the birds didn't finish, because a warm pile of leftovers in a run is a mold factory. The bucket from the kitchen was a supplement. It was never a nutrition calculator. Now, the forgotten protein sources. This is the section I most wanted to reach. Number 13 is sour milk, skim milk, buttermilk, and whey. To a lot of people today, chickens and milk sounds strange. On a farm with a cow, it was
Now we're finally patching the side that plain grain keeps leaving short.
obvious. The cream went to butter for the family. What was left, the skim, the buttermilk, the whey off the cheese, was still a value stream, and it did not go down the drain. And there's real sense in it. Milk protein is high quality, rich in exactly the amino acids grain is short on, plus calcium and B vitamins. It was one of the few things a farm made on its own that helped fill that methionine hole. But let me be straight about the ceiling, because a bucket of milk is not a bag of feed. Liquid skim milk is around 90% water. Dried skim milk runs about 1/3 protein by weight. That's an enormous difference. And it means the concentrated milk products in old commercial rations were dried, not poured. Fresh skim in a trough is a good supplement and a poor ration. It also spoils fast in a warm run, so keep it to small amounts and take up what they don't finish. Some of the most valuable chicken scraps on an old farm weren't vegetables at all. They were protein byproducts. Number 14 is meat and fish scraps, and this one needs care. Start with the fact, because it corrects a modern myth. Chickens are not naturally vegetarian. Historic rations leaned on animal protein deliberately.
This next source sounds rough, but the nutritional logic is very old.
Meat and bone meal, blood meal, feather meal, fish meal. These were and are legitimate ingredients precisely because they carry the amino acids grains lack, and fish meal is still called out as one of the best natural sources of methionine, so the principle is sound. Grain alone left a protein hole, and farmers filled it with animal protein. But I am not telling you to dump old meat in your chicken run. Handle any animal protein the way you'd handle it in your own kitchen. Fresh or cooked, never spoiled. Nothing from an animal that died of something you can't explain, and small amounts. Cooked bones splinter. And check your own state's rules, because feeding animal-derived material to livestock is regulated differently from place to place. The lesson isn't that spoiled meat belongs in a chicken pen. It's that grain by itself left a hole those farmers had to fill. Number 15 is cooked surplus or infertile eggs, and I'll admit this one makes eyebrows go up. Feeding eggs to chickens? Yes. On a farm running an incubator or setting hens, you end up with clear eggs that never developed. And in a heavy spring, more...
The pattern hasn't changed. Use the byproduct, but respect its limits.
Eggs than the family or the market can move. Cooked and crumbled. That's about the most complete protein on the place. It isn't cannibalism, and it doesn't teach egg eating, provided you cook them and don't hand a hen a broken raw egg in the nest box to puzzle over. But it's a small stream and a seasonal one. It's nutrient recycling. Those nutrients stayed inside the farm instead of going out with the trash. That was enough. Now, that 16th thing I promised you. The most important thing those old farmers put in front of a chicken that wasn't food: grit, and its cousin, calcium. A chicken has no teeth. Everything she eats gets ground in the gizzard, and the gizzard needs hard, insoluble stone to do it.
Now comes the one thing that makes all that food usable.
That's grit, small rocks. Birds on open ground usually find their own. Confined birds, or birds getting whole and cracked grain, need you to provide it. Calcium is a different job entirely. Oyster shell, limestone. That's the egg shell, and a laying hen burns through it fast. And here's where I see people go wrong constantly, because the two look alike in a bag. Oregon State says it in one sentence. Oyster shell cannot be substituted for grit because it's too soft to aid in grinding. One is a tool, the other is a building material. Both belong in their own container, free choice, so the hen takes what she needs. The old chicken yard didn't just have food in it. It had the tools a chicken's digestive system needed in order to use that food. So let's put all 15 in order, because a list is not a system. I call this the feed replacement ladder, and it's 4 rungs. Level 1 is treat and waste recovery. Orchard fruit, watery garden culls, most table scraps, worth doing, not worth counting. Subtract a scoop of feed every time you toss in a...
We've got the pieces. Now we need a way to rank them honestly.
Split melon, and you'll be underfeeding your flock and wondering why the eggs got small. Level 2 is energy offset. Corn, wheat, oats, barley, bran and middlings, pumpkins and root crops. These genuinely displace calories, and in a cold month that matters. But energy is not nutrition, and here's the trap. A complete feed is balanced to a certain calorie level. Every scoop of plain grain on top dilutes the protein, vitamins, and minerals across the whole day's intake. The University of Georgia says scratch should never be mixed into a complete formulated diet for exactly that reason. You can feed your birds more and nourish them less. Level 3 is nutrient contributor. Insects, good forage, alfalfa and clover, dairy byproducts, properly handled animal protein, surplus eggs. These carry real protein, real vitamins, real minerals, and they're worth managing on purpose. But notice what they share. Everyone is seasonal or unreliable. That's not a flaw in your management. That's the nature of the thing itself. Level 4 is ration formulation territory, and this is the boundary that matters most. Replace most of a complete commercial feed, and you are no longer feeding scraps. You are formulating a poultry ration. That means energy, protein, individual amino acids, calcium, phosphorus, vitamins, trace minerals, all of it adjusted for the age of the bird and whether she's laying. Mississippi State describes complete feeds as designed to contain all the protein, energy, vitamins, minerals, and other nutrients needed, and notes the amount of each required changes with species, age, productive state, environment, and disease status. People do that well, but it's a different job. Supplementing feed is old-fashioned thrift. Replacing a ration is animal nutrition. Those are not the same job. I put that whole ladder into a printable guide because it's a lot to hold in your head standing in a feed aisle. It's called the Appalachian Chicken Feed Ladder, and it ranks all 15 sources by what they actually provide, with the season, the honest replacement value, the main limitation, and a safety note. There's a 1-page refrigerator sheet, a scrap safety checklist, and a blank flock observation sheet. It's free, and the link is down in the description. Before we finish, 5 things the old method does not excuse. 1. Moldy anything. Molds produce mycotoxins, and depending on which mold, which toxin, how much, and how long, they hit liver, gut, immune function, and production. Feed that costs nothing stops being cheap the day it costs you a hen. 2. Raw soybeans. Mississippi State is unambiguous. Raw soybeans should never be fed to poultry. They contain enzyme inhibitors that interfere with digestion and have to be roasted or steamed first. 3. Avocado. The Merck Veterinary Manual lists chickens among species susceptible to avocado toxicosis. Chickens appear more resistant than caged birds, but the leaves are the most toxic part, and there's no good reason to find out where your hen's line is. 4. assuming chickens will balance themselves. Free choice feeding is a real historical system. But those systems offer a deliberate energy source, a deliberate protein source, and a deliberate mineral source, and let the bird choose among them. That is not the same as scattering leftovers and hoping instinct sorts it out. 5. Forgetting water. Every poultry source I read for this puts...
Instinct helps, but only when you give the bird sensible choices.
Water first. Kentucky Extension notes an animal can live longer without food than without water, that a whole egg is about 78% water, and that in a laying flock, a shortage of water for just a few hours can cut egg production. All the clever feeding in the world doesn't survive a frozen waterer, so let me leave you with this. I don't think the thing worth bringing back from those old farms is an ingredient. It isn't corn, and it isn't buttermilk, and it certainly isn't a sprouting tray. It's the habit of mind. Those families looked at every single thing that came off that place and asked what it was good for, and just as important, what it wasn't. Corn had a job, milk had a job, bugs had a job, greens had a job, grit had a job. Nothing had to do every job. The University of Georgia has a line in its backyard flock circular I keep coming back to. There is no...
That's the part worth keeping. Judgment, not nostalgia.
Perfect food. No one ingredient contains every nutrient an animal needs in the exact amounts it needs it. Those farmers would have nodded at that. They weren't hunting for one free thing to replace a feed sack. They were trying to waste as little of the farm as possible while still giving the flock what it needed. That's not a recipe. That's a way of paying attention. Thanks for sitting with me a while. Go check your grit.